So kind of a bold title here, why we think Bitcoin may be the most important technology of this decade. So we're going to be talking today mostly on behalf of Andreessen Horowitz. Let me give my very quick bio and then jump into it. So this is me. I'm the CEO of 21, best funded company in Bitcoin, I guess. Partnered at Andreessen Horowitz. Before this, I co-founded Council and taught a MOOC at Stanford with 200,000 students. A little bit about 21. So basically yesterday there was a Wall Street Journal article that came out, should be in the print edition today. Essentially we've developed an embeddable Bitcoin mining chip that can be put into any device. So from laptops, cell phones, printers, routers, et cetera, or into existing chipsets. So if you've got a video chip, for example, H.264, you can put one of our cores in there, and then the chip is plugged into the wall, it repatriates money to you. So silicon as a service. So we think that's going to be interesting. Qualcomm, Cisco, Kozla, et cetera, are all investors. But let's leave that for another time. So let's just talk about this. Why do we believe at A16Z that Bitcoin may be the most important technology of this decade? So if you step back with me to 1994, what is this internet thing anyway? It's a great clip by Bryant Gumbel and company of the Today Show. Basically, he's talking about what is this @ symbol, and you can Google it. It's YouTube, Bryant Gumbel 1994, and what is internet anyway? And that's really what we want to kind of talk about. What is Bitcoin, right? And the concept here is we've got about 5 theses, and kind of a FAQ to go through frequently asked questions. And this Andreessen Horowitz thesis on Bitcoin, 5 sub-theses. So number 1, Bitcoin is a protocol. Number 2, we believe Bitcoin is here to stay. In 2013, that was a question mark. I don't believe it's a question mark anymore. Number 3, by many measures, Bitcoin is bigger than Google. So there's hopefully still in the audience or listening in. But Bitcoin mining is by many measures bigger than public estimates of Google's supercomputer. Number 4, Bitcoin has a very powerful network effect with 4 different players in that network effect: miners, developers, merchants, and users. Number 5, Bitcoin is open source. We believe that a good analogy for Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is to PayPal as Linux is to Windows. And in the same way that people coordinated around, everybody who did not own an operating system coordinated around Linux, in the same way everybody who does not own a payments rail, we believe, is going to coordinate around Bitcoin. And then I'll go through the FAQ and what we think of as the most important question on Bitcoin. So first, let me kind of motivate Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a protocol. What do we mean by that when we say payments are now packets? So if you think about, if you think about physical cash, right? When person A hands person B a dollar bill, right? Then person A knows person B no longer has that dollar bill. But with digital cash, if person A sends the dollar bill to the serial numbers of that dollar bill to person B, then person A may still have a copy of the serial numbers, right? As such, they have the temptation to potentially double spend. So the solution to this is something we call, today, centralized digital cash, where you have an intermediate, a PayPal, for example, where the debit of A corresponds to a debit in a central ledger of a central actor, and then B gets a credit, and that central actor records everything, right? But the answer is really decentralized digital cash, right? So that is to say, with Bitcoin, what you can do is you can replace that central actor with a decentralized network of miners, right? And what this does, it means it solves things in a decentralized way. And that is pretty interesting because the actual technology underneath it, we can go through all the pieces, but basically this is why we think of Bitcoin as a protocol. You can actually go through, kind of packet traces. You can actually, at the command line, you can send packets to the Bitcoin network, and you can receive acknowledgements that your payment has actually been included in a mined block. That's a Wireshark trace there. So, think about what's going on there at the command line. Just like you can ping a remote machine without any communication with AT&T, you can now send a payment of eventually arbitrary complexity without talking to any bank of any kind, right? Between any peer on the network, right? So this is very interesting and looks completely different from how we kind of think of payments in the current payment rails. It's worth actually going and learning how this rail works, but you can also just abstract it away and just think of it a new way to send money over the internet. And so that's why we compare Bitcoin to the internet, right? Before with AT&T, for example, you'd have to do a deal with a telco before the internet to deploy code related to information on the network backbone. But after the internet became mainstream, any node could communicate with any other node without any process, without any fixed cost to go and close a business development deal with a centralized intermediary. In the same way, we think of Bitcoin as distributing banks, right? So before Bitcoin, you'd have to go and do a deal effectively with a bank, either implicitly or explicitly. Implicitly, if you go and work with PayPal, for example, because underlying that is a bank, underlying that is Fedwire and so on. Or explicitly if one goes and actually communicates with the bank. Whereas afterwards with Bitcoin, you can go peer-to-peer and any node can talk to any other node. And so, one way of thinking about this is that to the end user, Bitcoin is like email. That is to say, you have an email address and you have a password, and anybody who has your public email address can send you email. But only you with your private password can send email out from that address. In the same way, anybody who has your public Bitcoin address can send you Bitcoin, but only you with your password can actually send out from that address. And so importantly, just like email, there's nobody who owns Bitcoin. There's no bitcoin.com. The code is open source. I mean, there is a bitcoin.com, but it's not getting revenue from it. So second point, Bitcoin is here to stay. We think that institutional momentum, it's now beyond a tipping point. And so essentially, large government actors, large financial actors, so Bernanke, Yellen, Larry Summers have all made positive statements about Bitcoin. In fact, yesterday, Larry Summers just announced that he's joining the Strategic Advisory Board of 21 and has said, at first we may be surprised by the presence of a technology like embedded mining. Eventually, we may be surprised by its absence. So it's become, fairly bullish on Bitcoin. The way I put it is, that was kind of how money was printed in the 20th century, and now here's how it's printed in the 21st. With finance, NASDAQ, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Wall Street, many mainstream financial institutions have now embraced Bitcoin, written reports, et cetera. Very, very, very different scenario than 2013, 2014. We think, 2014 in particular was a year of institutional acceptance. Many governments have made positive statements. In technology, GitHub repositories, wallets, Google integration, startups, market penetration, it's still early, but hundreds, thousands of merchants that accept Bitcoin, PayPal, Stripe, Braintree, all the payment systems do, pop media coverage, VC investing is on pace for $1 billion plus this year. And just to dive into this a little bit, we have all three, kind of past, present, and alternate future, Federal Reserve chairs have said positive things. We have, multiple federal government agencies have said neutral to positive things. One of my favorite lines is, when the U.S. government sold 30,000 Bitcoins recently, they wouldn't have sold 30 kilos of cocaine, right? So it's a de facto legitimization of Bitcoin when they did that, right? State governments as well, you've got New York out in front with their bit license, but you've got a bunch of, various state governments that have said positive things and that are competing to legalize Bitcoin. Outside the U.S., it's even more positive in many countries. So, Chancellor Osborne of the UK wants to make Britain Bitcoin country. Japan has said it's not going to regulate Bitcoin. Bitcoin makes Aliyah in Israel. And in fact, if you take, I thought that was a great headline. If you take the global perspective, right, interestingly, only really China and Russia are the large countries that have sort of impeded Bitcoin. And even there, it's something where, China's nominally communist, but everybody's a capitalist. So, they contain contradictions, right? Like what we've done. So Bitcoin is actually doing pretty well on an international scale, and just given where the network is, it's just very difficult to actually ban it. It's not a centralized actor. Nobody can be fined and put in jail to stop a Bitcoin transaction from happening. You'd have to basically shut down every miner in the world, and at this point, that's close to shutting down the internet because of how distributed it is. In terms of institutional finance, so more on this. Just there's ETFs out there. There's NYSE just today launched a Bitcoin index. Here's an example of NYSE USAA and BBVA investing in Coinbase. I mentioned Larry Summers, working with us. And so essentially, we think it's not right now, but maybe in like a year or 2 years, we're going to see a number of companies talking about, what's your Bitcoin strategy? Just like, what's your social media strategy? Each kind of vertical has sort of taken their own business and then intersected it with Bitcoin. So if you're in payments, you're kind of implementing with payments. If you're a merchant, you're accepting it. If you're in news media, you're writing about it. If you're in gaming, then you're accepting it for in-game points. So for example, Xbox and Zynga. Governments we already mentioned, venture capital already mentioned, iBanking already mentioned. And so basically, what is your Bitcoin strategy is kind of what more and more groups are going to be thinking about. Just like your internet strategy, if you dealt with information as a business, you needed something, at least a website. If you deal with money as a business, which most businesses deal with, you may eventually need to learn something about Bitcoin. So third point, this is a provocative one, right? Bitcoin is bigger than Google. What do we mean by that, right? Basically, all of Google, if you took all of Google's servers, by our calculations, that would represent less than 1% of mining capacity worldwide, right? And that's insane. That's actually crazy. So let's actually talk about that. So basically, Bitcoin mining over the last 18 to 24 months was basically up 100x year over year, and then S-curved out as it hit Moore's law. Basically, this means all of these data centers around the world are being built, and part of the Bitcoin protocol is to stand in front of your data center and cross your arms like this. That's how block is mine, right? But this is this incredible distributed computing build-out that's never of its kind that's been observed before, where all these people are otherwise unknown to each other, right? Maybe some of the guys know each other, but they are all working together on this thing called Bitcoin. It's co-opetition, similar to venture capital in some ways. And the interesting thing about this is what they've built is something which is bigger than Google by this measure. So just as an example, a few years ago, there's a guy who estimated around 1.5 to 2.4 million servers for Google. Let's say they've got 10 million servers, right? We can actually go to kind of estimates of how much mining individual CPUs produce. And we can take like your top-of-the-line Xeons, and we can estimate, okay, what if you've got 10 million servers, and each server has a top-of-the-line Xeon with 1 to 10 mega hashes per CPU, and you've got on the order of 10 CPUs per server. That works out to roughly 1 petahash of capacity, right? But the worldwide Bitcoin network is 350 petahashes of capacity. So that would mean that if Google shut down search, mail, maps, et cetera, under the assumption that they have 10 million servers, maybe they've got 100 million, but even then it would still not be very much relative to all of Bitcoin. They shut down everything and they pointed at mining, and they're less than 1% of the global mining network. So that's really interesting, right? It reminds me of social in like the early 2000s. This thing that was sort of dismissed as a joke actually turned out to be the biggest thing ever, right? With literally everybody in the world knows about it, and billions of people are on Facebook at least on a yearly basis, if not a monthly basis. And so in the same way, this Bitcoin thing kind of dismissed as a joke has suddenly become one of the world's largest supercomputers. That's actually pretty interesting. Now, here's another measure in which kind of Bitcoin is pretty large. Basically, in 2011, Google talked about how many megawatts of power its global compute infrastructure took. And under the assumption that there's roughly 1 megawatt per petahash, and a petahash is basically a measure of compute in the Bitcoin network, we look at Bitcoin as consuming more power than Google did as well, right? And this may become more of an issue over time. So fourth point, Bitcoin is open source, right? So people often ask, why couldn't you just do this with PayPal? Why couldn't everybody just adopt PayPal? And that gets fundamentally to coordination and incentive problems, right? In the 90s, when people tried to do micropayments in the browser, the fundamental issue was who's going to be the troll, right? Who is actually going to run the payments rail and collect the payments? The browser manufacturer wanted to do it, the operating system wanted to do it, the bank wanted to do it, and since everybody wanted to do it, no one could do it, right? Bitcoin is sort of a decentralized commons where nobody can own it in quite the same way. So you think of it as a programmable and customizable OS for money. And this slide, I think, is a useful one. When we say Bitcoin is to PayPal as Linux is to Windows, there's a lot of points you can unpack out of that, right? So first is, in the upper left, every entity can now get banking, right? In the same way we went from a human-associated landline to an internet, machine-associated IP address, we go from a human-associated bank account to a machine Bitcoin wallet, right? And that has important and subtle implications. Every device that's connected to the internet can now send and receive money. This can be done in every country. Any country that has power and internet, which is every country, can now send and receive money. On the same system, you can send every amount, right? From the tiniest amount of money, basically fractions and fractions of a cent, much smaller than you could think of with cash today, to the very, very largest amount, like the GDPs of entire countries. You can essentially do it with Bitcoin. And this is very different from the current way we think about money. We think about we've got cash, we've got credit cards, we've got wire transfers. You've got different modalities for different quantities and frequencies of transaction. And now we suddenly unify all of that into a theoretically uniform whole called Bitcoin, right? And this is similar to how we went from having separate physical mail systems, the postal office, and broadcast systems like NBC, and telephony systems like AT&T, into this single programmable communications medium called the internet, right? And so when people ask, is Bitcoin a commodity? Is it a currency? Is it an equity? Is it this? It's all of those and more besides. It's a programmable value transfer mechanism where you can subdivide it and make it look like a stock. You can make it look like a commodity, et cetera, okay? So it's extensible. This is important because many people will quote modern, or contemporary rather, limitations of Bitcoin, for example, transaction times or transaction fees or things like that. But the internet wasn't built for video, right? At the early days of the internet, we were not able to do YouTube, and over time it got upgraded. In the same way, there's a number of different modifications to the Bitcoin protocol that are out there that are being adopted. It's getting better. It's unfreezable, so people often have a problem with PayPal in that it can freeze your account. That cannot happen with a Bitcoin account. It's free and open source, and this is just the payment system. We haven't gotten to the contract language and multi-signature and all this other type of stuff that's in there. Multi-signature is basically a way to put a board of directors vote into a program. And so the potential of this is pretty substantial. To give some examples, I talked about how it's extensible. There's all this forking and modification that's taking place. People are contributing to this commons. It's this ferment of ideas. And we've seen that movie before, right? We've seen what happens when you have an open source competitor which has all these different organizations. Even if they mutually don't like each other or have incentives aligned with each other, they can all align around, okay, we all want Bitcoin to be better, right? That's extremely powerful. Okay, next point. Bitcoin has a network effect, right? So with 4 sides. This is one of the reasons we believe it's going to be pretty much unstoppable. So miners, developers, merchants, and users. Miners go in, they coin the currency, and developers basically get more trust in the infrastructure as miners invest in it. Developers and merchants build applications and things that can be bought and sold for Bitcoin, and then users then have more demand for Bitcoin. This increases the demand, hence the price, hence miners mine more. And this is kind of one of the feedback loops that we've got here. And so because of this, it is really going to be, in our view, Bitcoin or nothing. Everything is going to be either built on Bitcoin or, for a reason, Bitcoin will fail, and then we have like 10 years before the next decentralized currencies, like Second Life did with VR, and then we had 10 years before Oculus, right? But we don't think Bitcoin is going to fail. If you look at the adoption metrics, they're actually all up, other than one, which is the price, which I'll come to in a second. There's more than 8 million wallets, and that's fairly good growth for the ecosystem as a whole. That's from late 2014, 2015. Record transaction volumes. So transaction volumes in the network are up. There's a roadmap to improve scalability of the network to increase the number of transactions per second. There's huge open source and startup traction, so investments and repos, and that's only till mid-2014. It's probably accelerated since then. And in terms of price, the short-term view on price is basically that due to the increase in the hash rate, miners and merchants have basically been selling Bitcoin, and this sell pressure has pushed the price down. It's almost like a canonical, Gartner hype cycle sort of valley. And I'll come back to the point on price in a second. But the long-term view on price is basically that, over 5 years, 6 years, it's gone up 5 orders of magnitude from 1 cent to $250, right? So there is something substantial happening there, but we'll need something new in order to reverse the downward price trend, which is not completely unimportant as an aggregate measure of interest in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So in terms of facts, let me talk through some quick facts, and maybe I can even take a question or two. So facts. So people ask various kinds of questions about Bitcoin. Is it modifiable? And we've gone through some of that already. The answer is yes. There's Bitcoin improved proposals, much like IERTFs. That's or rather IETF request for comments. Is it secure? So that's an important point. Basically, in the same way that one can distinguish a counterfeiting operation and a bank robbery, you can distinguish the ability to counterfeit a Bitcoin and to rob an exchange, right? Bitcoin itself, the technology has not been broken, but exchanges have been robbed. In the same way that it's very different to counterfeit a dollar versus to rob a bank. So while there have been robberies, there haven't been counterfeits of Bitcoin. Is it scalable? We talked about scalability. One kind of meme that you'll see out there, kind of the fourth point over here, is the blockchain going to win rather than Bitcoin, right? And we think that is unlikely, mainly because for a blockchain to exist as we currently understand it, you need to have Bitcoin, right? So that is to say, in the lower right corner there, the way that Bitcoin works is you have transactions, so A pays B and C pays A and so on. And what the miner does is they validate these transactions, and in return for validating these transactions, they add an n plus first transaction to that block, which is a direct deposit to themselves, right? That's their incentive for actually running Bitcoin, right? And so because of that, it seems difficult to decouple a blockchain and Bitcoin, because that chain of blocks over there is something where to generate the next block in the chain, the miner is supposed to get some Bitcoin, right? Hence, without some digital incentive to do this, a decentralized one that any miner can compete on, we don't know how to build such a system, right? So that's why the blockchain, not Bitcoin type stuff, that's the narrow interpretation of why it's wrong. The broad interpretation of why it might be right is a blockchain, not Bitcoin says that the informational rather than the monetary uses of Bitcoin are going to be the predominant ones over the next 5 years. For example, device authentication and things like that, right? And so that it's not a completely dumb concept, but it's something which one wants to approach with some degree of sophistication. Other concepts, so people talk about the 51% attack, right? That is to say, and now I'm getting a little more technical, but if you controlled more than 50% of mining capacity worldwide, would you be able to degrade the Bitcoin network? That's something that's been known about since the early days. We believe it's somewhat overhyped in the sense that there are actually technical countermeasures against it. That's a post by Gavin Andreessen on that. Other people ask, does Bitcoin have fundamental value? Is it just like tulips? And so, what we always say in response to that is yes, they're exactly like tulips that you can teleport anywhere in the world in arbitrary quantities programmatically, right? But the fundamental value of Bitcoin, we think, is essentially that if one believes that databases have value, and I think that is established just by global database penetration and Oracle sales volumes and so on, the blockchain is a first global, always accessible, undeletable database. And you can think of an amount of Bitcoin as the right, R-I-G-H-T, to write, W-R-I-T-E, to that database, right? So if databases have value, and if the right to write to a database has value, then Satoshis and Bitcoin have value, independent of any external exchange rate, right? So for example, if you as another example, if you believe that notaries have value, like a notary public, right, you go to notarize a document, the blockchain can serve as a public notary, a global public notary, that you can basically go and notarize a document with a small amount of Bitcoin. So that bootstraps value. That's like the most, kind of basic industrial use of Bitcoin. And so we do think it does have fundamental value. Legal issues. So I think that, at this point, the traction, among governmental institutions is high enough. And then people talk about alternatives like Litecoin and Dogecoin and Stellar and so on and so forth. So I don't really think any of those is sort of compellingly advantageous over Bitcoin. One of them does deserve a mention, which is Apple Pay. What is the relationship sort of Apple Pay and Bitcoin? And again, to go to an internet analogy, if you're in the early 90s, you can branch television in two directions. You can branch in the direction of HD TV, like high definition TV, doing what we've already done, just better. And that's a multi-billion-dollar business, very legitimate business, et cetera. Or you can branch in the direction of the internet, which initially is kind of worse, but over time develops into something that's very interesting and powerful. And that's sort of how we compare like Apple Pay versus Bitcoin. Apple Pay is very useful. It's useful today. It's doing what we already are doing better. It's a better way to pay at Crate and Barrel and to do mesoscale transactions. But we think Bitcoin is useful for transactions that can't even exist today, like true micropayments, for example. So perhaps the most frequent question is, what about that Bitcoin price, right? This is what people ask. And so the long-term view on price, one can be sophisticated about it. If you think about market depth, right, you've got a balance of buy and sell orders. A price does not come from Mons Olympus. A price comes from the interplay of these two kind of factors. And if you've got more buy than sell orders, the low point of the valley will move to the right. That is to say, it will move towards a higher price. Or conversely, if you've got more sell than buy orders, it'll move towards a lower price. One way of sort of modeling and thinking about Bitcoin is if you imagine that every miner is selling all of their Bitcoin every day at market price, that gives a quantification of what the sell pressure is on a daily basis. And then conversely, by balance, if the price remains stable, what the buy pressure must be to make that price stable, right? So this is roughly, $900,000, about $1 million a day currently in terms of sell and buy pressure, balancing at $250. One thing that is going to happen next year is halving. That is to say, the amount of Bitcoin that is awarded to miners halves into 12.5 Bitcoin rather than 25. So that means that your sell kind of thing drops in half like this, and then the price will start creeping up, assuming that buy pressure remains constant. This is what happened in late 2013. We think that's going to be at least one of the things that's going to mean a run-up in price, but at least mid next year. So this is kind of one aspect of price, is just the pure buy and sell, supply and demand. But there's another aspect of price which we think is very important, which is that the way to not, if sell orders are what decrease the price, then you don't want to sell Bitcoin. Okay, then why would you get Bitcoin? So the first answer to get Bitcoin is as a financial instrument. That's say you buy it with an intent to sell it later on. But a second answer, which is not really there right now, is you buy Bitcoin in order to use it, right? And a subtlety with Bitcoin that people I don't think have yet taken on board completely is, yes, it's possible to buy a laptop from Dell.com, but Dell cannot pay its vendors in Bitcoin, right? Therefore, Dell has to initiate a sell order. So all you've done is defer the sell order by one step in order to buy a laptop from Dell with Bitcoin. Dell then executes the sell order of that Bitcoin and then pays its vendors in dollars, right? So what you actually need to sustain the price of Bitcoin are closed loops. That is to say, portions of the economy that just depend on Bitcoin going around, in the same way that the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker all exchange dollars in this closed loop. You need something like that in Bitcoin. And to show that that has some precedent, for example, you've got very small countries like Estonia with 1.3 million people that had their own currency until 2011, right? And so it is possible with just 1 million people to sustain an economy, right? That where everybody accepts a currency. And Bitcoin is already larger than that, right? But it's on the internet. All these points are dispersed, right? So the interesting question here is, for the long-term sustenance of the Bitcoin price, you need these closed loops. And so you need to be able to build, not just speculate. And that, to me, is basically the most important question in Bitcoin is, can we build this cloud economy, right? Can we build those closed loops? Can we build that cloud economy? Perhaps the most important question in Bitcoin. What does that look like, right? When you have people who are dispersed internationally rather than focused in one geographical area, is there some way that you can build closed loops among them? So just let's recap and summarize. We talked about 5 different points in this thesis, right? So Bitcoin is a protocol. Payments are now packets. You can decentralize that centralized actor, the bank. Bitcoin is here to stay. We believe the institutional momentum is, runaway at this point. Bitcoin is bigger than Google in the sense that, by public estimates of Google's server capacity, if they pointed all of their resources at mining, it'd be less than 1%. Bitcoin has a network effect in the sense that there's 4 players in this network, and each of them, as they grow, they improve the others. Bitcoin is open source. It is to PayPal as Linux is to Windows. And finally, we think the most important question of Bitcoin for the price is related to the other most important question, which is how do we build the cloud economy? Okay, so thank you.
So thank you, Balaji. We have time for one question. I know that was quite comprehensive, and there's a lot of things you might want to dive into. So one question only. All in back, yeah.
So it seems like Bitcoin needs a killer app in order to kind of get this in order to fly. Do you have a sense for what that might be?
Yeah, sure. So obviously I have a thesis, and I'm going to talk my book here for a second. So with that proviso, written a blog post which you can Google called "A Bitcoin Miner in Every Device in Every Hand," sort of a conscious nod to Gates's computer in every desk in every home. And we think that integrated Bitcoin mining in devices will, among other things, solve the long-standing micropayments problem. That's to say, if by plugging your device into the wall, you have a very small amount of Satoshis generated continuously, now you can actually do content micropayments. Now you can actually pay for APIs and so on with the digital currency generated on your device. We think that is going to actually be how it's going to start, with low-stakes transactions rather than high-stakes transactions. That is to say, for sort of relatively trivial things like content and for in-app purchases and so on, versus very high-stakes things like governments and contracts and all that type of stuff.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.